everyone, and welcome to The Unevenly Distributed Future is Here and It Sucks. I know the card was just up with the description of the panel, but I'm just going to read it for anyone who prefers that. We live in a cyberpunk dystopia. Social media delivers surveillance and misinformation while selling our attention to the highest bidder. Artificial intelligence is rewiring our brains. Cryptocurrency is killing the planet, and the largest tech companies are both mega rich and mega powerful. How might we analyze early and recent cyberpunk in light of developments in technology, geopolitics, the global economy, and the climate crisis? And how can cyberpunk evolve now that reality is caught up with it? And first, I'd just like to do introductions, like who are you and why did you want to be on this panel? And we'll start with Christopher.
I'm Christopher Brown, Chris to my friends, and I'm a novelist mainly, write science fiction. I've 3 books out, Tropic of Kansas, Rule of Capture and Failed State, which was a Philip K. Dick Award finalist this year. And I kind of, I probably write science fiction because of the cyberpunk I read in the 80s as much as anything. I mean, that and the J.G. Ballard books I read in the 80s. And I remember specifically like reading Neuromancer, like as I was finishing college late in the 80s and just being like, having the stylistic voice of it more than anything kind of really excite me and make me think like, yeah, that's something I want to do. I want to do, try to do something like that. And I ended up over the course of the subsequent years, kind of devouring most of the OOV, and then also living in the world of being a technology lawyer by day, working in the technology business and seeing how capital kind of completely consumed and colonized and co-opted the liberated territory of cyberspace. And so when I saw this panel description, it sort of rang very true to me. And I don't really write cyberpunk. I suppose some people have classified me as post-cyberpunk, but the influences are there kind of coming at me from both sides, both the kind of the real world of it and the fictional possibilities of it. And I think that this is a really fun topic to explore.
Yeah. Mike, how about you?
Well, okay. I'm Mike Allen, and I wear various figurative hats. And I am the publisher and editor of Mythic Delirium books. Worth mentioning that I'm the publisher of Nicole Cornerstace's novel Latchkey, which she may get to talk about a bit herself in this panel. And I am also a writer. I am actually one of the nominees for the Shirley Jackson Award for Best Short Story Collection. That ceremony happening tonight for my book Aftermath of an Industrial Accident, which is
very good. Read it.
Thank you.
That's an amazing title. I love it.
Well, it's a collection of horror stories of all kinds of different flavors, and among them are stories of, dystopian futures. So that is a realm that I have dabbled in as a writer. In terms of, I guess, what interests me in writing that sort of story, it's a combination of, I guess, having had my imagination captured in dark ways by dystopian stories that I have read or seen in cinema. And also, I think it is not particularly easy, I think, just as a creative person to pay close attention to what is happening in the world and not be inclined to think dystopia is coming, or as the title of this panel suggests, dystopia is here already, and we need to figure out how we deal with it. So I've attempted that some in fiction, I suppose, and that's why I decided to give this panel a crack.
Francesca?
Oh, well, I'm a science fiction writer and editor of future fiction. I've been writing science fiction since 15 years. I won 2 major Italian science fiction awards and 2 Italy awards with a novel called Idol and another one called Next Human, which has been published in the US by Apex. And then I published another book called Bloodbusters, which has been published in the UK by Luna Press. And these books are out in China as well. And be grown up with cyberpunk. Really, it has been my source of inspiration for the last 10 years. But in the last 5 years, I've embraced solar punk. So I have also another kind of let's say, source of imagination or ideal, let's say, an exit strategy to the present time that we are currently living in. And on Future Fiction, I've mapped more than 160 stories coming from 35 countries and in translation from 14 languages. That means that I've been also collecting these stories and seeing also where the real cyberpunk is also taking place in many of the developing countries of the world. So I have understanding of how these say phenomenon has been growing and changing and affecting also other landscape, other economies, other cultures, which is important because cyberpunk is not a monolithic phenomenon, but it has different kind of applications in the world. So I think this panel was really intriguing and really interesting, and I'm here for that.
Matt?
Hi, I'm Matthew Kressel. I've been a finalist for the Nebula Award 3 times, World Fantasy Award once, and the Eugene Foster Memorial Award. I have a story out last month on Tor.com, science fiction called Now We Paint Worlds. I also co-host the Fantastic Fiction, a KGB series with Ellen Datlow, which we've been live streaming. So if you get a chance, check that out. A lot of people know me from the Moksha submission system. If you submitted a story to one of the major markets, science fiction fantasy markets in the past few years, you probably use the Moksha submission system. That's mine. I work in IT. That's my day job. I've been writing various kind of cyberpunkish stories for a while, mainly focusing on technology and change. Some near future, some far future. My YA novel that's currently at my agent is about AI and the singularity, if you want to call it that. But I think this panel interested me a lot, similar to what Francisco said about this idea that solar punk as a transition out of the current dystopia or current situation that we're in. And I have more thoughts on that as we go forward. But yeah, that's.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely want to talk about like cyberpunk offshoots like solar punk, hope punk, biopunk, all that cool stuff that we're having now. In the meantime, I'm Nicole Corner-Stace. I have several novels out. My most recent adult novel is called Firebreak, out from Saga in this past May. And that's really like why I'm here. I read this panel description, and every single aspect of this, apart from the cryptocurrency bit, is like, I address that in my novel. And like, I grew up really, really gravitating toward dystopias and cyberpunk dystopias, probably cyberpunk mostly because it's like the most realistic dystopia, and you can see it happening now. And I liked, when I was younger, when I was a teenager, I'd watch these movies and read these books, and I'd love the aesthetic, I'd love the muscularity of the language and the prose. And it wasn't until I was older that I started like rereading things or rewatching things and analyzing them with this idea of like interrogating the tropes. Like, everybody knows what a cyberpunk city looks like, but you have like this almost like commodification of, corporate surveillance, police brutality, all of this stuff. And I like cyberpunk that kind of puts the punk back into it, punk as in punk rock, as in punching up. I think that's very important. And that's part of why I want to talk about solar punk, hope punk, like the more optimistic offshoots. Yeah, so when I first read this panel, the first thing that I thought of was there was this article that I saw in The Guardian a few years ago. It was like 2018, I think, and it was called Neon and Corporate Dystopias. Why does cyberpunk refuse to move on? And they say, why is it that cyberpunk still looks like it did in the 80s? Perhaps there has been no need for it to change. It continues to resonate with us because the world it depicts is the one we live in, which is, you know, fair, I guess. And then it goes on to talk about like these huge, like Colossus properties, like, you know, Cyberpunk 2077 and the Blade Runner reboot and all of these things. And they're basically saying that all they do is rehash the same tropes over and over again. They don't interrogate any of it. And I think that's fair, but I think where the really interesting stuff happens is kind of around the margins of those giant Colossus titles. Like that's where the cool shit is. I think in any genre, like that's where the envelope gets pushed. And like now we have, over the past several years, there's been like so much cyberpunk written by authors of color and women and non-binary authors and queer authors, and just reclaiming a lot of these things that are kind of taken for granted in the old school cyberpunk aesthetic. And I think that's really interesting. So given that we have all of these offshoots of cyberpunk now, you know, solar punk, hope punk, all of these, how do you in your own work address the fact that we're very much in the future that early cyberpunk predicted? And like what I like to, when I moderate panels, I like to like not go like right down the line, just jump in if you have something to say, because I know like putting people on the spot sometimes, like it doesn't, I don't know, just say whatever you're thinking.
I mean, I would just jump in and just say like, so I like I said, I work in IT, and one of the things I see a lot, and this is not just small companies, but large companies, is just people who are in charge of technology who don't really understand how that technology fits together and the risk factors involved. Like large, giant companies with no full-time security people. So, you know, I wrote a near future, very dystopian story recently called Your Future is Pending, which is basically like, yeah, we have all these automated systems, things are running, but no one's at the helm, no one's steering the ship. And that terrifies me because like, I'm literally seeing it with my own eyes. It's not this hypothetical abstract thing. So I think a lot of cyberpunk fiction, and I think cyberpunk may be a subgenre of dystopia, is about that fear, of being overwhelmed by the world and the technology, the corporations, and just inundated by something that's beyond our control, technologically, usually.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I tried to wrestle with it in my first novel, Tropic of Kansas, and like I said, I had been writing kind of very heavily sort of cyberpunk influenced short fiction, and in that book, I was trying to set out to imagine, you know, an uprising, a popular uprising, in a kind of a mirror version of the U.S., one in which a lot of the kind of cyberpunk tropes were of kind of a corporatized state, complete with a kind of a CEO, president, and the whole deal were a kind of a ubiquitous part of the background. And I was trying to imagine, like, what would a cyberpunk influenced more authentically participatory democracy look like? Like trying to find the hope in the cyberpunk realm. Like these people have all these technologies, and in the prototypical cyberpunk narrative, it's about individual appropriation of these technologies towards more emancipatory ends, right? Towards like, I want to be able to express, to Nicole, to your point, with kind of more contemporary people using kind of classic cyberpunk tropes towards more kind of novel and fresh voices and expressions of identity, right? And that's attractive, but how does it work on a mass scale to kind of like really turn the society upside down? And where I ended up was, I found that the only way I could get through it was to attack and interrogate the things that I thought cyberpunk was completely failing to do, which was to address the ecological underpinnings of that society and get beyond the technophilia of that kind of like Blade Runner smoky city. And like, okay, it's like the end of Blade Runner, they go outside of town, like, wait, don't stop there, I want to find out what's out there. And trying to like really kind of grapple with that, because I suspect in those societies, as in our own, most of the kind of social and political problems and injustices and inequalities and the hoarding of surplus by big corporations or whatever, they're all ultimately rooted in the damaged relationship the society has with the land and its environment. So that's kind of where I took it.
My explorations in dystopia are kind of all over the map. I have a pair of short stories that I wrote that are now collected in my book, The Spider Tapestries.
Also very good, read it.
Oh, thank you. that are, and they're set in a very, very, very far future, or at least to my mind, that's how I'm imagining it. And they're actually ekphrastic stories. They're inspired by the artwork of Alessandro Bavari, an Italian artist and filmmaker. And I wasn't so much attempting to extrapolate any trends to create, from our present to create this world, as so much to look at these images and imagine, okay, what if somebody actually lived in this doctored photograph, what would that be like? But one of the characteristics of the society, I imagine, that really very much came from now, was this idea that surveillance is just omnipresent everywhere from every direction, and you just live with it. Like you just, it's like something that people aren't even troubled about, because of course we're always being spied on all the time. And I thought, and I feel like, I mean, that definitely exists now, and I think folks are either equally as flippant or oblivious to it now. Those stories also kind of imagine the world as the most I got into ecology is like everything's sort of a flattened, gray, overpopulated wasteland, like everywhere you go. And where they've needed to make more room for people, they've dug down. So you could just the surface of the planet is just riddled with colonies like bees, but of people, genetically modified people, and etc. And so that sounds very grim, but it's actually a really fun environment to write in, just because there's so much to work with in terms of bringing surprise into the narrative. The title story of my collection, Aftermath of an Industrial Accident, is actually a borrowed dystopia. It's set in a city called Punktown, which is a place that was actually created by a writer named Jeffrey Thomas. This story first appeared in a tribute anthology, and you could describe the environment of Punktown as sort of Blade Runner with aliens. But what I chose to write about was kind of a corporate horror story, where the entire story takes place inside this sort of office building and plant, and where because of the industrial accident of the title, these sort of Lovecraftian extra-dimensional creatures have been unleashed within the building. And my characters my characters in what I felt like what I felt to be a pretty accurate reflection of every corporation I've ever been a part of are much more concerned with the consequences for them in the corporate hierarchy of what's happening than the fact that, you know, people are actually being, you know, drained of blood and torn to pieces, you know, just one room over. And I think, you know, definitely, there are so many things to be frightened of out there in the world, but you know, the bizarre, the bizarre from any rational any rational viewpoint, mind frames that you find kind of, you know, in corporate America and elsewhere, where you know, the survival, you know, the survival of the corporation, you know, seems to involve, you know, looking at the humans who provide, you know, who provide the labor as, you know, disposable parts to be shed away. You know, it's I don't know. It's never been fun to live it. I'll say that.
It's definitely more fun to write than to live. And that's like,
Yes.
it's interesting how some of the things that you bring up in that, like, our real life cyberpunk dystopia is so insidious. Like, a while ago, people might say, you know, oh, like looking at this cyberpunk dystopia in this novel or this movie, it would never get to be like that, because, you know, people would riot, they would march on Washington, they do all of this stuff. And like, it doesn't matter what people like, not to be super pessimistic, but it's, you know, like, we're, like you said, we're totally fine with being surveilled upon all the time. And
Yep.
like all of the, like, it's impossible to boycott corporations because they're all owned by, like, all of the little, you know, many of the very, like, ostensibly indie brands are owned by corporations now. And it's like, you cannot avoid it. It's everywhere. It has just seeped into every aspect of our lives, but not like in a dramatic way that makes good fiction, just like in a really shitty, bleak way that we can't escape.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Well, I think that this narrative of cyberpunk has served well the previous 30 years. And in fact, it was 2003 when William Gibson said the future is already here, but is not evenly distributed. But 20 years later, we see that as soon as a piece of technology gets out of Google, or of iPad or iPhone or whatever, it's immediately in the disposition of people, whether they are in Tokyo or Mumbai or Rio de Janeiro or Los Angeles. It's the same layer of technology.
Mhm.
So I think that the paradigm has changed radically, because cyberpunk has addressed many of the issues that we're currently living, and it served well as a science fiction narrative. But at the moment, it is not addressing any new issue that has been arising over the last 20 years. Just to mention Anthropocene, just to mention radical inclusivity, just to mention sustainability, these kind of things that were just weak signals at that time, and now are becoming major, crucial signals. So we need a new narrative, and I do think that, with all due respect, with you know, William Gibson and Bruce Sterling and my friend Jim Kelly, Pat Cadigan, all, you know, the bunch of excellent writers that we all grew up with, but we need now an update to that narrative. And I think that it has a name, and it's called solar punk, even though maybe the punk element would be, I don't know, not very in line with what this kind of new movement is advocating, because it's a collective cooperative way of trying to say, okay, we know the problems, but the previous generation hasn't done anything about it. So let's try to figure out some exit strategies to this situation. So I think that the two things can, of course, still talk to each other, because one comes out from the other. But solar punk has some very fresh and important things to say that cyberpunk couldn't possibly imagine. They couldn't possibly figure out that the consequences of globalization was the coming back of native innovation from the countries that have been populated by this very technology.
Yeah.
So William Gibson was, pointing out that Japan, but we have China now. So the rising of, Nigeria, the rising of the Arab states that are launching satellites into space, or India, these are playing big shift and changes in the global narratives. So I think there's a lot to find out and to explore and to analyze in those landscapes.
So like you were saying, like in terms of like solar punk. So I have a few thoughts of that, and I'll bring it back to cyberpunk in a second. So like the punk suffix is like to literature what the gate suffix is to politics, right? It's just they put it on everything.
Yes.
And the original punk aesthetic was like, counterculture, right? And you do what you want, you don't care about the rules. And actually, that's what solar punk is. It is counter to the prevailing culture of like, over industrialization, over hyper capitalism. So it is a punk aesthetic in the sense that it's very, very different from the prevailing culture. So I actually think that term works.
Yeah,
and
sorry,
the thing
it's correct, but not everybody can understand that because they still remember the original punk.
The original punk, they think of like Sex Pistols, right?
Yeah.
But like the thing about dystopia and cyberpunk in particular is it was a particular aesthetic that, like, let's be honest, William Gibson and Ridley Scott with Blade Runner made it cool. It was cool. It was like, yeah, I'm a cyberpunk. Like I'm, oh, that's such a cool city, to hang out. Like, I remember reading a couple of years ago on Twitter when the Blade Runner sequel came out, someone's like, oh, I'd really love to live in that Blade Runner world. And I'm like, what? What? Like, do you realize how horrible that world is and what kind of terrible life you would have in that world? They made it sexy. They made it cool. I mean, I just reread Neuromancer for a panel I was on, and Case is he just, like, Gibson drops at the beginning that Case arbitrarily like just killed 3 people, but he's played as like the cool guy, and we never really know, like, were those 3 people innocent? Did he just like kill them? Like, so he's just a cold-blooded guy, and he's going through this thing, and there's a part in the middle where Molly just kills people who are working for a corporation, and I always remember like that scene in Clerks, if any of you have seen that movie, where they're talking about the Death Star and like, what about all the the blue collar people working at the Death Star that died? And my point is, like, they, like, all these writers, or I won't say all of them, I would say that, like, initially cyberpunk and dystopias were made cool, they were made sexy, and I think that's what we're seeing now. And as you guys have said, in the sense that, like, the stuff that cyberpunk predicted in the 80s is coming true now. We're seeing this, we're seeing, VR, maybe not as immersive as they predicted, but we're seeing, computers in our pocket. And like, we talked about this right before we went live, is like ransomware. Like, ransomware is right out of a Gibson novel, right? So I'm excited. Like, I've written dystopias, I've written pseudo cyberpunk stories. I'm excited about solar punk as a genre, because I do think that it allows us to move from these dark dystopian rainy scenarios. You were saying, Francesco, or I think it was Mike, I forget who said it, but there was no trees, like, in these cyberpunk dystopian worlds. Like, where's
not in mine.
how is this sustainable? you know, like Coruscant and Star Wars, like where's the fucking trees,
Totally.
right? So you can't have a world like that unless you have like massive oxygen generating things. But I wouldn't want to live in a world like that. So I think like if we can interrogate like the faults of cyberpunk and like where it's failing us now, like this obsession with dark techno dystopias, why is that not a why is solar punk a better narrative to explore those themes than staying with cyberpunk? I mean, at least that's where I am creatively. You know?
Cyberpunk never really had any politics, I don't think. It never really had a critique of the world around it. It had an aesthetic. It's all about an aesthetic. And even about, like, to your point about making dystopia cool, it's all about the cool aesthetic. It was also about making science fiction cool,
Yeah.
right?
Well,
this
that's
kind
true.
of nerdy genre these days, and they wanted to write science fiction that was like as cool as the bands they were listening to, right?
Yeah.
And I think that there's never really any critique of the worlds that cyberpunk inhabits, that it conjures, because really it's kind of just funhouse mirror versions of the real world with extrapolations of the technology that's already around us. And it's not about like changing those worlds, but about just figuring out how do you navigate the dystopia you find yourself in, right?
Yes.
But the failure is in romanticizing dystopia. It's a kind of a romantic aesthetic of the grungy, fucked up world that we're actually living in, and it sort of anticipates what's right around the corner, right? But yeah, Francesco, go ahead.
Oh, I would go a step further and say that people have the privilege of indulging in this dystopia, because if you actually live
Yes.
in the dystopia, you want to go out, you want to escape. As Matthew said, I don't want to live in a world like that, but that's not a matter of you wanting something. It's the place where you are born in. So that's why I'm saying it's important to pay attention to the rising countries, because they have been living in this dystopia.
Yep.
They really are into the dystopia. I mean, think about Brazil, think about Bangladesh, or you know, Afghanistan, okay? But they have the same kind of connections at the moment, and they have access to the same internet that we do. So this kind of puts everybody on the same ship, you know, on the same level. Of course, I'm not talking about accessibility and money, but on a pure speculative level, we are on the same boat, okay, technologically. But we're not having the same solutions, because the West is still indulging in this dystopia, while the rest of the world is trying to figure out a way to get out of that. Because don't forget that climate and justice is putting a higher burden on much poorer countries. It's not the same thing when the hurricane hits, you know, the south coast of the US and it hits Haiti, or it hits, you know, the Kuala Lumpur, right?
It's a great point. There's a wonderful Mexican cyberpunk film called Sleep Dealer that kind of does exactly what Francesco's talking about. And it's about this, it's directed by a Peruvian American filmmaker, Alex Rivera, came out in like 2008, but it's about this Oaxacan farm kid who's a hacker. And he's living in this area where like American water companies control all the local water supplies. So all the farms are going dry. And he ends up having to, because his hacking gets him in trouble, he has to go to Tijuana, to the big city where the way you survive is you get this kind of like street jack in. And what you do is you get jack in to operate factory robots on the other side of the border, building the glistening skyscrapers you can see over the border wall. And it's a great example, to Francesco's point, of a cyberpunk story from the perspective of kind of a more of a global South point of view, of like of being the people who are more have a little less agency about how those technologies are used to colonize their particular reality. And I think a solar punk that could unite that kind of political critique, maybe with some of the with its own indigenous or diverse aesthetic, like a really strong aesthetic, which I'm not sure is something that solar punk currently has. It's something I could get really excited about, but I think lots of people are working in that direction.
Yeah, one place that you actually see, I could like do a whole entire panel just about like cyberpunk indie video games, but I'm not going to get into it in depth here. But like, that's one place where there are in cyberpunk indie video games these days, there are stories like coming out that interrogate the aesthetic and interrogate all of these various issues. And there was an article called "If Cyberpunk is going to survive, it has to drop the racism," which is a really good article. And it's not just about racism, though. It also, although that is a whole other thing that we could get into here with Cyberpunk, but it name drops a bunch of really interesting games that if you're at all interested in cyberpunk stories being told by diverse voices, I highly suggest you check out that article and some of the games that it mentions. Because yeah, it's definitely true that we're all kind of on the same level in terms of like what technology exists, but a lot of the other kind of aspects of the cyberpunk aesthetic, like the massive wealth gap and the police are out of control, like those things are never going to target everyone equally. Like so I want to talk about like what's next. Like I love the idea of moving into solar punk, hope punk, whatever you want to call these various subgenres, because I think, or just like flipping more tropes in cyberpunk to make it more optimistic. I think we need optimism at this point. Like we've had a lot of just bleak, dreary, neon raining noir cyberpunk things, but I think we should move on. Like, I don't know. And like even like also just, you see a lot of the past year, there have been a lot of people who you see like, oh, I don't want to read this book because it's so dark and bleak and reminds me of how shitty the world is. I mean, last year in particular. And so like they miss out on things. Like they might miss out on something that's actually offering some hope, but you just look at something like, it's not about cyberpunk, but you might look at like a pandemic book and just go, no, not now. I'm not ready. Get back to me in 10 years and I might read that. But so yeah, let's talk more about like where do we go from here, because I'm really fascinated in what you all have been saying already about all of that, whether it's solar punk or other.
Let me jump in real quick.
Go ahead, Mike.
So I want to say, we have a question that's been listed. Can we talk about solar punk and hope punk? We've talked a lot about solar punk, which we should. I recently had to give an interview about hope punk, which was fascinating because it's not something I would call myself an expert on. I would say that Nicole's Firebreak is for somebody who is looking for hope punk. Firebreak is totally hope punk.
Thank you.
So please check it out. The original definition of hope punk, as it was first described in an article, I believe, that appeared in the Daily Dot, was actually very vague, and it kind of raised some skepticism because there were people, myself included, who read that article and was like, well, gosh, hope punk could be anything, the way this is described. But what I personally feel has happened, and my fellow panelists can agree or disagree with me, that's fine, is that this idea of a subgenre called hope punk kind of got put out there, in the world, in the interweb world, that is so crucial to cyberpunk, solar punk, etc. And it seemed to me like tons of readers just heard hope punk and we're like, okay, I don't know what that is, but it's what I want to read right now.
Yeah.
and so it's caught on in that sense. And my sense is that it is a reaction to these very dark narratives, possibly the pinnacle of which might be Game of Thrones in pop culture, which was at least in its earlier seasons a story in which the characters who you identified with, the forces of of righteousness and justice were constantly being outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and crushed by the characters who I identified with, with pure ambition, and with, with achieving their goals regardless of who else was harmed.
Also realistic.
Yeah. And so I definitely think there's a huge appetite right now for stories that acknowledge that, yes, there are people like this and things like this, but how do we deal with them? We don't want to just accept that this is going to be the outcome. We don't want to just accept that these are the forces that are going to win. Surely the side of righteousness and justice can outsmart and outmaneuver as well. And I think people are very hungry for those sorts of stories in a general sense. Now, solar punk, I guess, is much more specific in presenting plans, for how these things might be done. I cede the expertise on solar punk to my other panelists, but I wanted to share my impression of what hope punk is about and toss that into this mix.
Well, I got into a discussion with people on Twitter recently about this because there was some mini kerfuffle as there are on Twitter about, oh, there's no hope punk canon. And or whatever you think is hope punk is not, because the original quote unquote manifesto says it's not this. And I say, who cares, right? So
right.
Once you introduce a word into the English language, you can no longer control how it's used. I do think that, hope punk is used rather broadly, but so what? Someone's like, that's a hope punk story. I say, I don't think it is. Who cares? If you're a librarian and you're stacking it on the shelf in the hope punk section, maybe that matters. But to a reader like myself or as an author, I don't care. Someone else can classify it. So I do think that there's room for what I would call optimistic stories. And I think that when you say that word, optimistic science fiction or optimistic fiction, people automatically think two things. They think utopia and they think no conflict. And I say, well, that's not true. You could have an optimistic story and still have conflict. There's plenty of examples of this where the outcome is something that's positive, but you have to work through it. And I say this on a lot of panels. Utopia is not a noun, it's a verb, right? It's something that you work towards. And that process of working towards that better future is where the narrative lies, is where the conflict lies. And I think, that's why I'm excited by what you all are saying, in the sense of moving from this dystopian cyberpunk, hyper technological bleak future into this more positive one, is exactly where we are right now in this world, right? So we're talking about climate change and pandemic and all this stuff and all these anxieties that people have, and they say, well, how do we fix this? How do we get to a better future? And I think that's where there's a huge space for interesting stories to be told.
Let me just toss in real quick in this interview that I'm hinting at obliquely, the book that was cited as an example of hope punk was The Handmaid's Tale. So that's during that conversation, I think The Handmaid's Tale definitely would qualify this. I talked about hard hitting optimistic narratives where a path for hope is given, but also what needs to be overcome is presented unsparingly. And I think The Handmaid's Tale will definitely qualify there.
It's an interesting thing that happens with, I noticed this when my book Firebreak came out, and I was seeing feedback on it, and a lot of people, it ends on a hopeful note. As you say, it presents a very cyberpunk dystopia where it's literally everything is owned by corporations, two corporations that own everything, and they're literally at civil war. But it ends on a hopeful note. But there were readers who were really angry that I didn't like lay out a step-by-step procedure for like how like one lone nobody person would overcome, you know, corporations that own everything. And it made me think about like the idea of like how most dystopias, I think, are ultimately hope punk, in that a lot of them do end on like an optimistic note in some way. And so I don't really know. I'm not really sure where the designation like differs for me. But it was very interesting to see that like there were people who actually wanted like a step-by-step procedure laid out. And like if I knew how to do that, I wouldn't be wasting my time writing fiction about it. I would be doing it. But it's interesting. It's interesting to think about.
I think the problem with like a term like hope punk is that hope is such a generic like noun, right? And so it could apply to anything, right? And you know, like with cyberpunk, like you very specifically conjure up like a computer world or technology. Solar punk, you know, oh yeah, solar panels, solar power, renewable energy. But hope, it's like, boy, that could be a lot of stuff. I don't think it's a great term, but I do think that it's good that we're looking for things in that vein.
Yeah, it's definitely caught on, whether it's a great term or not.
Well, I think people have an appetite for stories that endeavor to imagine plausibly better futures. But I think to do it, you've got to have a level of realism to it. You've got to confront the truth, the dystopian truth of real life to get there, right? And I think, you know, science fiction has tremendous potential to try to a unique toolkit to do some of the things we have to get there, even like the ability to play with language in really innovative ways that lets us imagine to kind of get beyond the kind of thinking that kind of intrinsically moors us in this sort of reality we're in now, to even write novels and works of fiction that figure out a way to hack the thing that is so intrinsic to fiction and such a fundamental part of the problem, which is its preoccupation with the self, as opposed to community, as opposed to kind of other modes of how to think about the society. But I mean, I've tried to do it in these last few books, partly by unleashing a lawyer in dystopia, like a crusading lawyer. I thought was kind of a fun way to, you know, put a kind of Better Call Saul into the world of 1984, if you will. But and in the last book, I tried to imagine like people in a post-revolutionary kind of breakaway community trying to like rewild their environment and conduct like truth and reconciliation commissions for the rotten stuff that's gone on. But what I found is that a utopia grounded in realism is a tragedy. But to Matthew's point, it's about the process of trying to get there. And I think that's a worthy undertaking.
Yeah, I think that like the problem with the term hope is that in and of itself, it's not actionable. Like I just saw someone on Twitter this morning tell me that they saw somewhere on Facebook, someone said, you know, pray for our kids going back to school in like during the pandemic with no vaccines. Like, yes, that's hope, but it's maybe like look for solutions instead. I don't know. I'm seeing that we only have a few more minutes left. I don't know if they're going to send us questions, but I mean, in the meantime, just
I'd like to say
things we didn't get to.
A couple of things.
Yeah.
I think science fiction works as a counterface, in the sense that when things are good, like it was in the 80s, at least for the West, you know, we had a view of the future that was green, dark, and you know, probably the things are not so good as they seemed. And on the other side, when things are going very bad, we tend to this dystopia. Then probably the role of science fiction is to imagine an alternative, imagine a way out, imagine a counter narrative to that has become the mainstream narrative. And so as a science fiction writer, I feel the responsibility of imagining that alternative, because otherwise I'm just, you know, coping or reproducing the same pattern over and over again, and that's not fun for me.
Apparently we don't have any questions. Okay.
There were a couple of questions in the chat, but I think we did. The main one was, can we talk more about solar punk and hope punk? And we did. And the other one was
spent so much time on
the other one. Yeah. The other one was David Shaw asking if this is an Airstream trailer. I meant yes. The answer is yes. So we'll keep that. That's an easy one. So
yeah.
I'm here in the post-cyberpunk apocalyptic wastelands of COVID era Texas. This is the
But
only way
that
to
could be-
survive. Need
Wear
to be
your
ready to
neon
hit the road.
lights. We need
It
neon
could be
lights and
also
smoke.
cyberpunk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very
So yeah, I guess
solar
before
punk.
they cut us off, if anyone has any recommendations they'd like to make about any cyberpunk, hope punk, solar punk in any medium, books, TV, movies, video games, whatever, what should people be shoving into their brains if they want further info on this topic? What does it well in your estimation?
Yeah, I haven't read all of them, but if you're interested in solar punk, the editor Serena Ulibarri did a few solar punk anthologies. There's a famous one called Sun Vault: Stories of Solar Punk and Eco Speculation. A few years ago, there was
Also this one.
an anthology called Hieroglyphs, and then Yetzer Debris did an anthology of optimistic science fiction called Shine. So these are not as well known as they should be, but they're all really interesting books.
I would just shout out for my friend Andrew Dana Hudson, who is an excellent solar punk writer, and I'm very proud to publish his first anthology of short stories in Italian, which is his first collection of stories published.
I already mentioned Firebreak.
Thank you. Yeah, I had people recommend some stuff to me the other day on Twitter, and so I put up a list on there concurrently with this via the magic of scheduled tweets.
I would recommend Reckoning magazine, the journal. There's kind of a journal of environmental or ecological speculative fiction that kind of comes at it from a very different angle.
Ooh, I want to read that. All right, I'm seeing that we're pretty much out of time. I don't actually know how this ends if they just cut us off eventually. So if there's any closing comments anyone wants to make, if not, or if they cut us off, thank you all so much for being on this panel. You've all been amazing, and thank you to everyone who is in the audience, the virtual audience, and hopefully we'll see you in person next year.
I think we can continue on the Discord channel if people want to ask more questions.
Yeah.
I'm going to be jumping over there.
Yep, I'll get down
Right.
there.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Nicole.
Thank you so much, Nicole.
Thank you all.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you, Nicole. Thank you.
Visit me in the Mythic Delirium Books channel in the bookshop.
Yes.